If you're watching this channel, it's because you don't enjoy watching the world squander what Christendom built, but you want to do your part. And chances are you've heard me mention a great means by doing just that. Email made by and for Catholics. Check out fidei.email. That's FIDEI.email. Built for Catholic individuals, families, organizations, and groups. They're private, secure, and of course, they're Catholic. And they're offering 2 months off on your first year for an annual subscription if you enter the coupon code Return to Tradition without spaces. That's the name of this channel, without spaces, at checkout. I don't often talk here on this channel about we'll call it the Ted McCarrick problem. I reference it a lot, but I never specifically talk about cases involving individual priests. And for traditional Catholics, Catholics who spend their time defending traditional priestly fraternities, there is an elephant in the room that most of us casually ignore. And my own excuse for it is that I don't like talking about particular cases, innocent until proven guilty. And once a priest has his reputation tarnished by being accused of being a McCarrick type, it's impossible for him to recover. I've heard this from many priests personally, long before I ever picked up this microphone. But there is an elephant in the room. Most traditional apologists are at least friendly to the SSPX. When I say friendly, there's a few exceptions, but most of us are at least friendly to them. I am pro-SSPX, always have been, and probably always will be. But there is a problem. The SSPX, like every other priestly fraternity, has had their fair share of their own problems with the McCarrick problem. Because as best as they've tried to avoid having men like that in their ranks, and they've taken more measures than some other groups have, they have still had their problems. Certain now defunct Catholic alleged news organizations essentially destroyed themselves by, at least in part, by going after the SSPX ruthlessly. But there is some truth to it. They've had their problems. That can't be denied. There is a piece out there worth looking at. James Grind sent this to me, as did some others. It's an article describing how the SSPX adopted the 1983 Code of Canon Law, and that's how their problems with this really began. The old Code of Canon Law did not leave room for this problem. Usually what would happen before the 1983 Code of Canon Law took place was bishops would violate the Code of Canon Law and ignore the problem altogether. The new Code of Canon Law weirdly makes it if a person does a bad thing to many, we'll say altar boys, they are treated differently than a priest who does something one time. Because the many times, the habit there makes it sound as if it's just a problem of the mind and a sinful habit. And if I sounds like I'm using the kind of language somebody might, like a priest might use with a person confessing a 6th and 9th commandment violation, it should. There's a similarity there in the logic. And I'm not comparing the sins. Please do not misunderstand me at all. But the SSPX have their own problem. And I'm going to show you here, it's not so cut and dry though. This is not a defense of the SSPX and the errors that they've made on this issue. This is a reminder that the SSPX has a more complicated relationship with the Code of Canon Law. That really does beg a lot of questions, actually. I'm going to start here by giving you a bit from something Archbishop Lefebvre said about the new Code of Canon Law. And I will actually probably revisit this speech of his in full for a weekend video in the near future. But Archbishop Lefebvre gave what most people think is the SSPX response to the Code of Canon Law. And somewhere along the line, they seem to have changed that a little bit, as this Substack article I will go over here in a moment talks about. But here is an excerpt, a short excerpt from Archbishop Lefebvre's March 24th, 1984 speech at a conference given in Turin, Italy. Quote, "I want to speak to you of a very serious novelty, the new Code of Canon Law. I had not seen any necessity for a change. But if the law changes, and we must make use of it, for the Church can ask nothing evil from her faithful. However, when one reads this new Code of Canon Law, one discovers an entirely new conception of the Church. It is easy to be aware of, since John Paul II himself describes it in the Apostolic Constitution, which introduces the new code. Quote, "It follows that which constitutes the fundamental novelty of Vatican Council II in full continuity with the legislative tradition of the Church, this is to deceive, especially in which concerns ecclesiology, constitutes also the novelty of the new code. Hence, the novelty of the conception of the Church according to the Council is equally the novelty of the conception of the new code of canon law. What is this novelty? It is that there is no longer any difference between the clergy and the laity. There is now just the faithful, nothing else, on account of the, quote, doctrine according to which all the members of the people of God, according to the mode which is proper to each, partake in the triple priestly, prophetic, and royal function of Jesus Christ. To this doctrine is likewise attached that which concerns the duties and rights of the faithful, and particularly the laity, and finally the Church's involvement in ecumenism. End quote. I start there, not to talk about ecumenism and other things, but because the SSPX recognize the new code of canon law, will sometimes cite it when necessary, but if you've read a lot of SSPX articles and watched a lot of their conference talks and podcasts and the rest, you'll notice that they often cite the Code of Canon Law from 1917, which was the first Code of Canon Law. That is what they usually cite. But it's not so cut and dry as that either. They recognize the new Code of Canon Law, and unfortunately, as you're going to hear in this Substack piece, they have adopted the Code of Canon Law's treatment of priests with Ted McCarrick kinds of inclinations. You're going to see the problem here. Now, again, the rates of this being a problem in the SSPX are fundamentally smaller than they are in the rest of the Church, but they've had their own problems too. The point of this piece here that you're going to hear is that the real, looks like the real culprit here is the 1983 Code of Canon Law, that the Code of Canon Laws that exists in the Church now permits the McCarrick problem. It enables it. And because of that, until this is changed, at least this part of the Code of Canon Law, until that's changed, this problem is not going to go away because it's now built into the very legal structure of the Catholic Church. So we turn now to the Catholic Confidential Substack. This piece was written 5 days ago from the time I'm recording this, so by the time you're seeing this, about 7 days ago, with this headline: Lawsuit shows SSPX obedience to the 1983 pro-McCarrick law led to evil priests breaking up family of 8. And what this goes into here is there are a couple of priests are named, a Father Arnaud Ronstad and Father Pierre Duverger. They're both named in a lawsuit that's filed in Kansas, I think it is, where essentially these two evil men did the McCarrick kind of things to members of the family of a man named Stephen Sanborn. And the consequences of this broke the family up. How did this happen? This happened because of the Code of Canon Law, the modern one. And I'm going to go over some of this at length because it's actually like the canon law part here, I think, is the most important part. If you want to know how we got to this problem and how it's affected everybody except maybe Sedevacantists groups, because they're about the only ones that I've heard of that haven't had this problem. I've heard of any other priestly fraternity having had this problem at least once. The FSSP, unfortunately, had possibly the highest profile version of this recently among all traditional groups, unfortunately. But here is what is needed to understand this. So, from the article, quote, while the court will determine the merits of the case, it should be stated in the beginning of this article that had the SSPX rejected the 1983 Code of Canon Law, like other traditionalist groups, this situation would not have happened. Put another way, had the SSPX instead chosen the approach of long-standing traditional Catholic justice, the priests in question would never have arisen to the high office of the U.S. District Superior, nor would they have been reassigned following the charges of this kind of misconduct. Unlike other traditional groups who reject the 1983 Code of Canon Law mentioned in our previous report, such as groups led by Bishops Meikle, Sanborn, and Vigano, the SSPX claims obedience to the Roman Pontiff and their adoption of Vatican II's justice system via the 1983 Code. This portion of canon law, Canons 1341 and 1321, directly protects admitted bad men like Ronstad and alleged perpetrators like Duverger. But the SSPX picks and chooses when and how they submit to Rome regarding the 1983 Code. For example, when adjudicating annulments, see Canon 1065, the SSPX voluntarily rejects portions of the law. And when deciding the fate of evil men and McCarrick types, the sections of the 1983 Canon Code which seek to rehabilitate and heal these evil men instead of removing them are applied. Accusations of schism against the SSPX abound, but ironically, it is their precise obedience to the Holy Father in applying the 1983 Code of Canon Law that permits repeat offenders of these kind of deeds to remain in their ministry. Hence, it follows that what constitutes the substantial novelty of the Second Vatican Council, in line with the legislative tradition of the Church, especially in regard to ecclesiology, constitutes likewise the novelty of the new code. See John Paul II, Sacrae Disciplinae Legis, January 25th, 1983, which is his declaration promulgating the new code of canon law. This journalist has pleaded with the SSPX administration, priests, and leadership to immediately start protecting the faithful from evil clerics and reject this damnable section of the 1983 and the 2021 update of the Code of Canon Law. End quote. Now, a lot of this goes on to, quote church militant pieces, which I think is not a good idea, to be honest with you. But I will tell you this much. The Code of Canon Law here is what's at the accusation, right? So you get to the accusation that the Code of Canon Law is what is responsible for. At issue here are two parts of the Codes of Canon Law, two subsections of it. And the first is Canon 1321, subsection 1, which reads as follows, quote, any person is considered innocent until the contrary is proved. Subsection 2, no one can be punished unless the commission by him or her of an external violation of a law or precept is gravely imputable by reason or malice of culpability. 3, a person who deliberately violated a law or precept is bound by the penalty prescribed in that law or precept. If, however, the violation was due to the omission of due diligence, the person is not punished unless the law or precept proves otherwise. 4, where there have been external violation, imputability is presumed unless it appears otherwise. And then Canon 1341. The ordinary must start a judicial or administrative procedure for the imposition or the declaration of penalties when he perceives that neither by methods of pastoral care, especially fraternal correction, nor by a warning or correction, can be justified by sufficiently restored, the offender reformed, and the scandal repaired. End quote. So what you've got here, the key, I think, that causes so much problem is that the canon law here makes room for your reason being damaged. And this goes back to how we treat, I think, sins against the 6th and 9th commandment now in the church. And I think that it's not even so much a 6th and 9th commandment issue as much as this is a issue of reducing certain absolutely evil convictions and evil inclinations to simply the 6th and 9th commandment problem. When someone goes and has a habit of committing what Pope Pius XII called the private sin, they will very often, repeatedly, go to confession hundreds of times, maybe thousands of times over the course of their life, as they do everything in their power to break this evil habit they picked up typically in their adolescence. Ask any priest. Confessors will report that 90% of men and 80% of women confess that sin. And the church, at least in the modern age, gives a lot of, we'll say, leeway to people repeatedly going to confession for that same sin. And it looks like the same logic is applied here. The church, when you look at how a priest who has had one or two offenses of a McCarrick kind, the altar boy problem, we can call it, when they have done that once or twice, they're usually treated much more harshly than someone who's done it many, many times. This is why you have had these reports of these serial offenders being pushed around dioceses, moved from one diocese to the other. Okay, so those two priests from the SSPX are an illustration of this. I think it's wrong to try to destroy the SSPX over these kinds of problems that have happened. This is why I never agreed with what Church Militant was doing with that stuff. But we should be honest with ourselves, too. They've had this problem, too. And it really does look like it is the Code of Canon Law that enables this. And if it's a Code of Canon Law that enables this, I don't think this was done on purpose in the writing of the new code. The new code's got a lot of other problems, as that quote from Archbishop Lefebvre at the beginning said. Lefebvre makes it sound very clearly that this issue was an issue of ecumenical dialogue. That's why they changed the Code of Canon Law in the first place, to broaden the definition of Christian. But we also see something else here, and we can It's the spirit of ecumenical dialogue, too. Treating the McCarrick types, who have offended many times, as if they are dealing with some sort of mental affliction of some kind, and then trying to rehabilitate them, almost never with success, by the way, shows a leaning into the values of the world. This is how the world treats problems. It used to be that a priest who did these things was removed from ministry, period, full stop. They weren't allowed to function as a priest anymore, and they suffer severe legal consequences for it. I've often said the Vatican needs to go find its old Middle Ages dungeons, clean the things out, update them to basic modern humanitarian standards, and start making use of them for this kind of thing, regardless of what priestly fraternity or diocese the priest in question comes from. I'm less interested in the SSPX angle of this, other than on one issue. Why is it that Archbishop Lefebvre had a hostility to the new Code of Canon Law? But why is it that they still cite it anyway? They still lean into it. If they were in schism, they would not be referencing the Code of Canon Law at all. They'd see it completely invalid. They'd treat it in many places as invalid, but why do they use this justice system for it? Very curious about that. Very curious to see what you have to say about that. So let me know in the comments, please. What do you think of this problem? Do you think it's a sad reality that the SSPX has this problem too? Do you think it's something more fundamental to them? If, I won't come down hard on you like a ton of bricks if you're not exactly pro SSPX on this. Do you think this is this is on the flip side of that? The reason they have this problem is because they're too cozy to Rome, and they try to use some of Rome's logic, hence their adoption of the parts of the new Code of Canon Law. I'm curious what you have to say about this. Let me know in the comments, please. Hey, like and subscribe. If you haven't, it does help. So does sharing this on social media. That helps too. And as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.